Mongolia has one of the smallest Catholic communities in the world, with only 3 churches within its borders. And on the eve of his trip to the East Asian nation, Pope Francis is calling upon the faithful for prayers to accompany him on this apostolic journey.
I'm Christine Persichetti. It's a first for any pope, a trip to Mongolia, which borders Russia and China. For Catholics there, the papal visit is incredibly meaningful and a salve for those who lived under harsh communist rule for decades. Current News' Katie Vasquez is here with more. Hi, Katie.
Hi, thanks, Christine. I sat down with Professor of Mongolian history at Columbia University to talk about the country's history and about the significance of this visit by Pope Francis, both politically and spiritually.
Mongolia is a country that doesn't receive a lot of visits from foreign leaders, and this papal visit is historic. Pope Francis will be the first pontiff to visit the Asian country. Columbia University professor Morris Rosabi has visited the country 20 times and written or contributed to countless books on it.
A replica of Passport.
Out of 3.3 million people who live in Mongolia, a little more than 1,400 are Catholics. Although Rosabi says Catholics have been visiting since the 13th century.
There were a couple of Catholic priests who went up to Mongolia up until about 1920 and who tried to proselytize among the Mongols. Then communism took hold in 1921. And so that was forbidden.
When communism collapsed in 1990, the people of Mongolia were able to practice religion freely, and Christianity has grown, but the country is mostly Buddhist. The nation is right between China and Russia, which may be another reason for the papal visit. Pope Francis has tried to establish relations after years of no contact between the Vatican and Beijing.
Not a deal made, but a better relationship between the Chinese Catholic Church and the Vatican. And this visit to Mongolia might, strengthen that.
The Holy Father will spend most of his time in the capital, where half of the country's population lives. Rosabi expects him to also address the environment and poverty.
Mongolia has a high incidence of poverty. More than 30% of the people live below the poverty line.
Pope Francis will stay in Mongolia August 31st through September 4th, which Rosabi believes is longer than most foreign leaders.
This historic trip marks the Holy Father's 43rd apostolic journey abroad, and it will be the 61st country visited as Pope. Christine?
All right, Katie, thank you so much. After the fall of communism in 1991, religious practice was restored in Mongolia. Buddhism had been predominant before communism and is again the most widely practiced religion in Mongolia. But with the end of religious repression, the Catholic community grew. There are just under 1,500 Catholics in the country, and in 2003, a missionary from the Philippines was named Mongolia's first Catholic bishop. One of our reporters will witness this historic trip firsthand. Elise Allen, senior correspondent for Crux, will be traveling with the Pope to Mongolia. She joins us now. Hi, Elise.
Hi, Christine.
So, Elise, we know Pope Francis loves to visit places with small Catholic populations. As we mentioned already, there are fewer than 1,500 in Mongolia. So this trip really highlights the Pope's love of the peripheries, doesn't it?
You are absolutely right. I think this is the example par excellence, of the Pope's love of the peripheries and his preference for the peripheries. We've often seen him in his decade-long pontificate, prioritizing countries with small Catholic populations, maybe smaller countries instead of bigger countries. He's bypassed routinely large major global capitals in favor of these smaller places. And as you mentioned, there are less than 1,500 Catholics in Mongolia. There are only a couple dozen missionaries, and it's a fairly new church in a sense. Relations between the Vatican and Mongolia have existed in some form since the 13th century, but they were pretty much eradicated under communism. And the church really and Christianity really only came back. It sort of rebuilt itself after the Soviet rule fell in 1992. So it's sort of a new budding church. And Francis, I think, is really wanting to encourage the small population that's there, but also the faith that is sort of regaining its roots in this country.
May also be some geopolitical reasons why this papal trip is significant. Mongolia sits right between Russia and China. But how exactly will visiting this area of the world help the Vatican strengthen ties with China or engage Russia in peace talks when it comes to Ukraine?
I think it's going to happen in very subtle ways. I don't think we're going to get a very clear, strong, and firm message from Pope Francis directed at China or Russia. But of course, that's unavoidable. The fact that these two countries are Mongolia's neighbors is unavoidable. That's going to be an aspect of the trip that is certainly going to be present in whatever Pope Francis says and does. I think the fact that he is visiting in itself will help, because it shows each of these countries how serious he is about his desire to dialogue and to engage with them. He's long pursued dialogue and engagement with Chinese and Russian authorities, especially with the 2018 agreement with China on bishop appointments, and especially with the outbreak of the war in Ukraine last year. So I think the fact that he's going shows the authorities in each of these places exactly how serious he is, and I think that in itself will help. But I certainly expect that we'll have some subtleties from Pope Francis along the way that will aid in that.
All right, Elise Allen, senior correspondent for Crux. Have a safe trip, and we'll catch up with you again tomorrow.
Thanks, Christine.
All right, to other headlines now. Hurricane Idalia slammed into Florida's west coast near Tampa with a deadly storm surge and catastrophic winds not seen in the Gulf Coast in 125 years. Street flooding is widespread from Tampa to Tallahassee. Idalia is weakening as it moves toward Georgia. Defrocked Cardinal Theodore McCarrick is not competent to stand trial in a sex abuse case. A judge dismissed the case because he has dementia. The disgraced former Cardinal of Washington, D.C. was charged with sexually assaulting a teenage boy in Massachusetts decades ago. And Sister Jean, the much-beloved Catholic nun who just turned 104, threw out the first pitch at a Chicago Cubs game, but not before a warm-up. The Loyola sports chaplain is well known for her catchphrase, "Worship, work, win." Way to go, Sister Jean. And before we go, do you have a story idea or want to share a tip? Email us at newstips@desalesmedia.org or call our 24-hour number 718-517-3122. And that is this Currents News Update. I'm Christine Persichetti. Thank you for joining us, because we are putting your faith in the news. Hope to see you again next time.